December 7th, 1941. In the officers' mess aboard the carrier Akagi, Commander Fuchida Mitsuo sat with his fellow pilots, celebrating the most devastating surprise attack in naval history. They had crippled the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, over 2,000 Americans dead. Across the carrier, sack cups were raised in victory toasts. Japan had humiliated the greatest industrial power on Earth. But in the corner of the wardroom, Lieutenant Commander Genda Minoru, the brilliant tactician who had helped plan the attack, sat quietly, his expression troubled. When asked why he wasn't celebrating, Genda looked at his fellow officers and said something that would haunt Japanese naval aviation for the next 4 years. "We have won a great tactical victory today," he said, "but I fear we have simply awakened their factories." Most of the pilots laughed. The Americans, they assured Genda, were soft, decadent, more interested in jazz music and Hollywood films than in fighting wars. Their industry made automobiles and refrigerators, not weapons of war. Japan's warriors, they insisted, would prove superior to America's factory workers. This was the belief that pervaded the Imperial Japanese Navy in December 1941. They had studied American military capabilities. Yes, they knew about the battleships and carriers and aircraft, but they had fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting. They thought they were at war with the American military. They were actually at war with American industry. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mockery of American industrial capacity began long before Pearl Harbor. In the planning meetings for the Pacific War during 1940 and 1941, Japanese naval officers had repeatedly dismissed concerns about America's manufacturing capability. Admiral Nagano Osami, chief of the Navy General Staff, had famously declared that American workers were too pampered and undisciplined to match the dedication of Japanese laborers. He pointed to labor strikes in American factories, to workers who demanded weekends off and refused to work more than 8-hour shifts. How could such a workforce, he asked, compete with Japanese workers who would labor 12 or 14 hours without complaint, who would sacrifice everything for the emperor and the nation? The assessment seemed logical, based on the information available to Japanese intelligence. American factories in 1941 were still operating largely on peacetime schedules. Production of military equipment was relatively modest. The United States Army in 1941 numbered only around 1.5 million men, smaller than Japan's standing military. American aircraft production in 1940 totaled approximately 19,000 aircraft, respectable but not overwhelming. Japanese officers looked at these numbers and saw a nation unprepared for war, unwilling to make the sacrifices that war demanded. What they failed to understand was that those numbers represented American industry operating at a fraction of its capacity. The automobile factories of Detroit were building civilian cars. The shipyards were constructing merchant vessels. The aircraft plants were filling commercial orders. American industry in 1941 was like a sleeping giant, exactly as Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku had warned, and the Japanese High Command was about to wake it up. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the mockery continued. Japanese newspapers ran cartoons showing effeminate American soldiers fleeing from brave Japanese warriors. Radio broadcasts described America as a nation of cowards who would never endure the hardships of a prolonged Pacific War. Military intelligence assessments predicted that after 6 months, perhaps a year of defeats, the Americans would negotiate a settlement that would leave Japan in control of its conquered territories. The early months of the war seemed to confirm these predictions. Japanese forces swept through the Pacific with stunning speed. The Philippines fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered. The Dutch East Indies were captured. Hong Kong, Wake Island, Guam, all fell to Japanese forces. In every battle, Japanese troops demonstrated superior training, better equipment, more effective tactics. The Americans and their allies retreated everywhere. In March 1942, as Japanese forces consolidated their conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Naval General Staff commissioned a comprehensive assessment of American industrial capacity. The report, compiled by intelligence officers who had served in the United States before the war, should have terrified the High Command, but key sections were dismissed as enemy propaganda or pessimistic exaggeration. The report stated that American steel production in 1941 had reached 75 million tons. Japanese steel production that same year had been 7 million tons, a ratio of more than 10 to 1. The intelligence officers noted that American automobile production in 1941 had exceeded 4 million vehicles. Japan's automobile industry had produced approximately 50,000 vehicles, including both civilian and military models, a ratio of 80 to 1. The report detailed American oil production, 5 million barrels per day, from domestic sources. Japanese domestic oil production was negligible. Even with the captured oil fields of the Dutch East Indies now in Japanese hands, total production might reach 300,000 barrels per day, a ratio of nearly 17 to 1. Senior officers reviewing the report questioned these figures. They seemed impossible. No nation could possess such overwhelming industrial superiority. The intelligence officers must have made errors in calculation or fallen victim to American disinformation, but the officers who had compiled the report stood by their numbers. They had seen the American industrial heartland firsthand. They had visited the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the automotive plants of Detroit, the shipyards of both coasts. They knew what American industry could do. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, believed the report. He had spent years in America, had studied at Harvard, had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had driven across the American continent and seen the vast agricultural lands, the oil fields of Texas, the coal mines of Pennsylvania, the iron ore deposits of the Great Lakes region. He understood that America possessed resources on a scale that Japan simply could not match. More importantly, he had seen American organizational genius, the efficiency of American mass production, the ability to standardize and systematize manufacturing in ways that multiplied productivity. In a meeting with Prime Minister Tojo Hideki in early 1942, Yamamoto had tried one more time to explain what Japan was facing. "We have achieved great victories," Yamamoto said, "but these are tactical successes against an enemy that has not yet mobilized. When America's factories turn fully toward war production, we will face something we cannot defeat." Tojo dismissed the warning. The victories spoke for themselves. Japanese forces had demonstrated clear superiority. Fighting spirit, Tojo insisted, would overcome any material disadvantage. Yamamoto left the meeting knowing that Japan's leadership had committed the nation to a war it could not win. But he was a military officer bound by duty and discipline. His job was not to question policy, but to execute it as effectively as possible. He would give Japan the best possible chance in the naval war ahead, even though he knew the ultimate outcome was already determined. The first concrete evidence that American industry was mobilizing came in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese forces were attempting to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea when they encountered two American aircraft carriers, Lexington and Yorktown. The battle was the first naval engagement in history where the opposing fleets never came within sight of each other. All attacks were conducted by carrier aircraft. The Japanese achieved a tactical victory, sinking Lexington and damaging Yorktown severely. But they lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered heavy damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. More importantly, the carrier Zuikaku lost so many aircraft and pilots that she had to return to Japan for reconstitution. Even though the ship itself was undamaged, Japanese intelligence officers assessed that Yorktown had been damaged so severely that she would require at least 3 months of repairs, probably longer. That meant she would be out of action for the foreseeable future, effectively a strategic loss, even though she hadn't been sunk. But then came June 4th, 1942, and the Battle of Midway, and there was Yorktown, launching aircraft against the Japanese fleet. She had been repaired in 72 hours. The impossible had become reality. American shipyards, working around the clock, had performed repairs that should have taken months. They had mobilized every available worker, brought in specialists from across Hawaii, worked without stopping until Yorktown was combat-capable again. The Japanese officers who reviewed the battle reports couldn't believe it. There had to be a mistake. Perhaps it was a different carrier, misidentified by Japanese pilots in the heat of battle. But no, it was definitely Yorktown. American damage control and repair capabilities were far beyond anything Japanese planners had anticipated. And if they could repair that kind of damage in 3 days, what could they build, given time? The answer began arriving in intelligence reports through late 1942. American shipyards had multiple aircraft carriers under construction, not one or two, but dozens. The Americans were building Essex-class fleet carriers, each displacing over 30,000 tons, armed with dozens of aircraft capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean. And they weren't building them slowly. They were building them at a pace that seemed to defy the laws of physics and economics. In September 1942, intelligence reported that the first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was nearing completion. She would be commissioned by December. Less than 4 months after Midway, the Americans would have a brand new fleet carrier to replace Yorktown. But that was just the beginning. Intelligence identified at least 6 more Essex-class carriers under construction at various American shipyards. Construction times averaged around 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. The Americans were building fleet carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. The Naval General Staff reviewed these reports with growing concern. The numbers suggested that by mid-1944, the American Navy would have more fleet carriers than Japan had possessed at the start of the war, and that was just fleet carriers. The Americans were also building light carriers, escort carriers, dozens of them. They were converting merchant ship hulls into escort carriers using mass production techniques. Each escort carrier was smaller and less capable than a fleet carrier, but they could still launch aircraft, provide air cover for convoys, support amphibious landings. By late 1942, American shipyards were working at a pace that Japanese analysts found genuinely bewildering. In addition to the carriers, they were building destroyers, cruisers, battleships, submarines. They were building Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels, at a rate that seemed impossible. In September 1942, industrialist Henry Kaiser's Richmond shipyard launched a Liberty ship called Robert E. Peary in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. 4 days. Japanese shipyards required months to build equivalent vessels. Kaiser had revolutionized ship construction by applying automobile assembly line techniques. Pre-fabricated sections were built in factories far from the coast, transported by rail to shipyards, then welded together by workers who had never built ships before the war. Housewives, farmers, factory workers, people with no shipbuilding experience were trained in weeks and put to work. The results were staggering. By the end of 1942, American yards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, faster than seemed physically possible. But it wasn't just the ships, it was the aircraft. In October 1942, Japanese forces fighting in the Solomon Islands campaign around Guadalcanal began reporting something that made no tactical sense. They would shoot down American aircraft in aerial combat, achieving favorable exchange ratios, sometimes 2 American planes destroyed for every Japanese aircraft lost. By traditional military mathematics, this was success. Attrition warfare depended on inflicting more losses than you suffered, but 3 days later, the Americans would have their losses replaced. New aircraft would arrive on carriers or be assembled from crates at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Japanese, meanwhile, would still be waiting for replacement aircraft from Japan. Commander Okumiya Masatake, an experienced fighter pilot stationed at Rabaul, documented this phenomenon in his combat diary. In November 1942, he wrote, "We're achieving victory after victory in the air, shooting down American aircraft at rates that should cripple their air power. Yet every day they return in the same numbers, sometimes greater numbers. Where are all these aircraft coming from?" The answer was American factories, and those factories were just beginning to reach full production capacity. In December 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the Naval General Staff received a comprehensive intelligence assessment on American aircraft production. The numbers seemed like a typographical error. American aircraft production in 1942 was projected to reach 47,000 aircraft. Japan's production for the same year would be approximately 8,700 aircraft. The Americans were building 5 aircraft for every one Japanese aircraft, and 1942 was just the beginning. Intelligence projections suggested American production would continue increasing through 1943 and 1944. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Ugaki Matomi, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet and one of Yamamoto's closest advisors, reviewed the production figures in his headquarters aboard the battleship Yamato. He did the mathematics carefully, checking his calculations multiple times. If the Americans were producing aircraft at 5 times Japan's rate, and if combat attrition was roughly equal, then simple arithmetic showed that American air power would grow while Japanese air power shrank. Every month, the disparity would widen. Every battle, even if tactically successful for Japan, would leave the Americans relatively stronger. Ugaki wrote in his diary on December 15th, 1942, "The reports on American production are deeply troubling. If these numbers are accurate, and I have no reason to doubt our intelligence services, then we are not fighting a conventional war. We are fighting against an industrial system of unprecedented scale. The Americans can replace every aircraft we shoot down. We cannot replace ours. This is a war of attrition we cannot win." But Ugaki kept these thoughts private. Publicly, the line from high command remained optimistic. Japan was winning the war. The Americans, despite their material advantages, lacked the fighting spirit to endure a prolonged conflict. After sufficient losses, they would negotiate. This was the narrative presented to junior officers, to enlisted men, to the Japanese public. It had to be true because the alternative was unthinkable. By early 1943, the evidence of American industrial mobilization was becoming impossible to ignore. At Guadalcanal, Japanese forces that had once advanced confidently across the Pacific were now fighting desperately just to hold their positions. American supplies poured onto the island in quantities that seemed limitless. Weapons, ammunition, food, medicine, fuel, everything arrived in abundance, while Japanese forces scraped by on dwindling rations, their supply lines constantly harassed by American aircraft and submarines. In February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal, the first major territorial loss of the war. The Americans had not just defeated Japanese forces, they had overwhelmed them with material superiority. For every ton of supplies Japan managed to deliver, the Americans landed 10 tons. For every reinforcement soldier Japan sent, the Americans sent 5. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Admiral Koga Minichi, who assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death in April 1943, understood that the war had fundamentally changed. Japan could no longer rely on tactical superiority or warrior spirit to overcome material disadvantage when that disadvantage was measured in ratios of 10-1 or 20-1. But what could he do? Surrender was culturally unthinkable. Fighting to the death was the only option that preserved honor, even if death was now certain. In June 1943, the Naval General Staff convened a classified conference to assess the strategic situation. The intelligence officers presented updated production figures. American aircraft production for 1943 was projected to reach 85,000 aircraft. Japan would produce approximately 16,000. The ratio had grown to more than 5-1, approaching 6-1. American shipbuilding was equally overwhelming. In 1943 alone, American yards would launch more tonnage than Japan's entire merchant marine. Every single month, American production exceeded Japan's total capacity. The admirals sat in silence as the numbers were presented. Finally, someone asked the question everyone was thinking: how do we fight this? No one had an answer. You couldn't fight mathematics. You couldn't overcome industrial capacity that was 10 times, 20 times, 50 times greater than your own. Traditional military strategy assumed rough parity in resources, with victory going to the side with better tactics, better training, better leadership. But when one side possessed overwhelming material superiority, tactics became irrelevant. Admiral Toyota Somu, who would later command the combined fleet, reviewed the intelligence reports and reached a conclusion that he shared only with his closest staff. "We lost this war before it started," he said quietly. "We lost it in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. Every battle we win delays the inevitable. Every battle we lose accelerates it. But the outcome was determined the moment we attacked Pearl Harbor, because in that moment we awakened American industry." The spring and summer of 1943 brought more evidence. American forces began offensive operations in the Central Pacific, moving up through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Every operation demonstrated the same pattern. Americans would arrive with overwhelming force, supported by massive naval task forces, supplied by convoys that seemed inexhaustible. Japanese defenders would fight with desperate courage, inflicting casualties, destroying ships and aircraft. But the Americans would absorb the losses and keep coming because they could afford to trade at unfavorable ratios. For every American ship sunk, 2 more arrived. For every American aircraft shot down, 3 more appeared. Intelligence reports from Japanese forces across the Pacific told the same story with numbing repetition. In New Guinea, Japanese soldiers reported facing American troops equipped with new rifles, new radios, new vehicles. In the Central Pacific, Japanese pilots reported encountering new American fighters, faster and better armed than earlier models. Everywhere, American material superiority was growing, expanding, becoming more overwhelming with each passing month. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, opening a new front in Europe. This should have provided relief to Japan, forcing America to concentrate resources on 2 fronts. Instead, American production increased. The United States was fighting a 2-front war and still outproducing Japan by margins that seemed impossible. American factories were building aircraft for the European theater and the Pacific theater, and simultaneously producing more for each theater than Japan could produce for its single front. The psychological impact on Japanese officers who understood the true situation was devastating. They had spent their careers training for war, studying tactics and strategy, preparing to lead Japan's forces to victory. Now they understood that all that preparation was meaningless. They were leading their men into a war that could not be won, against an enemy that would simply build more ships and planes until Japanese resistance collapsed. Some officers, like Ugaki, documented their despair in private diaries. Others maintained stoic facades, performing their duties without acknowledging the hopelessness of the situation. A few, very few, began to question whether continuing the war served any purpose beyond prolonging suffering. But these doubts remained private. Japan's military culture did not permit defeatism. Surrender was dishonorable. Fighting to the death was the only acceptable option, even if death was certain. And so, the war continued, and American factories kept building. By September 1943, American aircraft production was running at over 7,000 aircraft per month. Japan's entire monthly output was approximately 1,300 aircraft. The Americans were building more than 5 aircraft for every single Japanese aircraft, and American aircraft were improving in quality, while Japanese aircraft remained largely unchanged. The new American fighters, F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, outperformed the Zero, Japan's frontline fighter. American bombers carried heavier bomb loads over longer ranges than Japanese bombers. Japanese aircraft factories were operating at maximum capacity, but maximum capacity meant working with limited raw materials, limited skilled labor, and facilities that were increasingly threatened by American bombing. Several factories had already been damaged in air raids. Production would decline if the raids continued and intensified, which seemed inevitable as American forces moved closer to the Japanese home islands. Commander Okumiya, still stationed at Rabaul, flying combat missions over the Solomons, wrote in his diary in October 1943, "I have been in continuous combat for over a year. I have shot down 16 American aircraft. I am considered an experienced pilot, one of the better ones, but I am exhausted. I have watched so many friends die. We destroy American aircraft every day, and every day, more appear. Where do they all come from? How many factories does America have? Do they build aircraft faster than we can shoot them down? It feels like we are fighting an endless enemy, one that cannot be defeated because there is always more. Okumiya's experience was repeated across every theater where Japanese forces engaged American air power. Pilots would achieve victories, shoot down enemy aircraft, return to base, exhausted and depleted, and the next day face the same number of enemy aircraft. The mathematics of attrition only worked if both sides faced similar constraints. American industry had removed those constraints. They could lose aircraft at unsustainable rates and simply build more to replace them. In November 1943, Admiral Toyota Soemu received the intelligence report that would crystallize everything into undeniable clarity. The document, compiled from multiple sources, including decoded American communications, published American government reports, and observations from Japanese agents operating in neutral countries, provided comprehensive production figures for American industry in 1943. American aircraft production for the year would total approximately 85,000 aircraft. Japan would produce 16,000. American steel production had reached 80 million tons. Japan's production was 7 million tons, actually declining slightly due to raw material shortages and Allied submarine warfare disrupting ore imports. American automobile production, even with most factories converted to military production, exceeded Japan's entire pre-war automotive industry. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But it was the shipbuilding figures that truly revealed the scale of what Japan faced. American shipyards in 1943 would launch 9 new Essex-class fleet carriers. 9. Japan had started the war with 6 fleet carriers and had built only 2 more since Pearl Harbor. The Americans were building 9 in a single year, and they weren't even at maximum production capacity yet. Beyond the fleet carriers, American yards were launching light carriers, escort carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and hundreds of support vessels. The Liberty ship production had reached a pace that defied comprehension. American yards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day, on average, 3 ships every single day. In the time it took Japan to build 1 cargo vessel, America built 90, and these weren't inferior vessels. They were solid, reliable ships that could carry 10,000 tons of cargo across the Pacific, keeping American forces supplied with everything they needed. Toyota read through the report 3 times, checking figures, looking for errors or exaggerations. He found none. The intelligence was solid, corroborated by multiple independent sources. This was reality. This was what Japan was fighting against. He summoned his senior staff officers and presented the report without comment. Let them read it themselves. Let them understand what they faced. The room fell silent. As the officers reviewed the documents, Captain Omai Toshikazu, Toyota's operations officer, was the first to speak. "Sir, if these numbers are accurate, then our situation is far worse than anyone has acknowledged. We cannot match this level of production. We cannot even approach it. Every battle we fight, we are depleting resources we cannot replace, while the Americans replace theirs easily." Toyota nodded slowly. "The numbers are accurate. I have verified them personally. The question is what we do with this information." But there was no good answer to that question. Japan's leaders had committed the nation to this war. Surrender was unthinkable. Fighting to the death was the only option that preserved honor, even if the outcome was already determined. All they could do was continue fighting, making the Americans pay the highest price possible for victory, hoping that perhaps somehow the cost would become too high and negotiations might become possible. It was a desperate hope, and Toyota knew it. The Americans had demonstrated no willingness to negotiate anything less than unconditional surrender. President Roosevelt had made that clear. And why would America negotiate when their industrial advantage grew larger every month? Time favored America absolutely. Every day the war continued, American factories produced more weapons, while Japanese factories struggled with dwindling resources. In December 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the combined fleet staff compiled a comprehensive assessment of the naval balance in the Pacific. The report made for grim reading. The Japanese Navy had started the war with 10 aircraft carriers of all types. Through new construction and conversions, that number had grown to 15 by December 1943, but losses had reduced the operational carrier force to 9. The United States Navy had started with 7 carriers in the Pacific. By December 1943, they had 28 operational carriers, with at least 15 more under construction or fitting out. The disparity in other ship types was equally stark. Japan had 7 battleships operational in the Pacific. America had 12, with more arriving monthly. Japan had 18 heavy cruisers. America had 23. Japan had approximately 100 destroyers. America had over 150, with dozens more launching every month. In submarines, the numbers were closer, but American submarines were proving far more effective than Japanese submarines. American subs were sinking Japanese merchant shipping at catastrophic rates, cutting off oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, disrupting supply lines to isolated garrisons across the Pacific. By early 1944, oil shortages had become critical. Japan's domestic oil production was negligible. The captured oil fields in the Dutch East Indies could produce enough to meet Japan's needs, but getting that oil back to Japan required tankers, and American submarines were sinking tankers faster than they could be replaced. Fuel became so scarce that major warships sat idle in port because there was no fuel to operate them. The battleship Yamamoto, the largest and most powerful battleship ever constructed, spent most of 1944 anchored at Truk and later at Kure because moving her consumed too much of Japan's dwindling fuel reserves. She was effectively a floating hotel, a symbol of Japan's might that could not be used because the nation lacked the resources to operate her. American sailors joked about Yamamoto being the Hotel Yamamoto, mocking Japan's inability to deploy its most powerful ship. Meanwhile, American shipyards launched the Iowa-class battleships, each one faster and more heavily armed than Yamamoto, and America built 4 of them, while Yamamoto sat idle. Not because America needed 4 super battleships, the war was being decided by carriers and aircraft, but because American industry could build them anyway, almost as an afterthought, while simultaneously producing everything else the war required. Japanese officers who had studied in America before the war tried desperately to explain to their colleagues what they were facing. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and survived through 3 years of brutal combat, met with younger officers in early 1944. They still spoke confidently of Japanese spirit overcoming material disadvantage. Fuchida tried to make them understand. "I have flown over American task forces," he told them. "I have seen their carriers, their battleships, their cruisers, their destroyers. There are so many ships that they darken the ocean, and for every ship I see, intelligence tells us there are 3 more in American ports, either under construction or preparing to deploy. This is not an enemy we can defeat through courage or skill. This is an enemy that possesses overwhelming material superiority, and that superiority grows larger every day." But the younger officers didn't want to believe it. They had been raised on stories of Japanese martial superiority. They had been taught that spirit and will could overcome any obstacle. Accepting that Japan was simply outproduced, outbuilt, outmanufactured meant accepting that the war was lost and always had been lost. That was too painful to acknowledge. In March 1944, American forces invaded the Marshall Islands, pushing deeper into the Central Pacific. Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage, inflicting casualties on the Americans, destroying landing craft and tanks. But for every American tank destroyed, 3 more came ashore. For every American aircraft shot down, 5 more appeared. The Americans simply had more of everything, and they could afford to trade at unfavorable ratios because their factories would replace the losses. The Marshall Islands fell in weeks. Japanese garrisons that might have held out for months in a war of equal resources were overwhelmed by sheer weight of American material. After the Marshalls came the Marianas. In June 1944, American forces assaulted Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Japanese High Command understood that losing the Marianas would bring American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The islands had to be defended at any cost. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo commanded the Mobile Fleet, Japan's primary carrier striking force. He had 9 carriers, with approximately 450 aircraft embarked. Intelligence indicated that American forces invading the Marianas were supported by at least 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft. The numerical disparity was brutal. More than 2 to 1 in carriers, more than 2 to 1 in aircraft. But Ozawa believed that superior Japanese pilot skill and better tactics could overcome numerical disadvantage. Japanese carriers could launch strikes at longer range than American carriers due to the lighter construction of Japanese aircraft. If Ozawa could strike first, hit the American carriers before they could launch, perhaps the numerical advantage could be neutralized. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan available. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 19th, 1944. Ozawa launched his strikes at maximum range, sending wave after wave of aircraft toward the American fleet. But American radar detected the incoming strikes at distances that gave American fighters time to intercept, far from the carriers. American fighter direction officers vectored Hellcat fighters onto the Japanese formations, and the slaughter began. Japanese pilots, many of them hastily trained replacements with minimal combat experience, flew into swarms of American fighters. The Americans had numbers, they had better aircraft, and they had months of combat experience. One by one, then by dozens, Japanese aircraft were shot down. Of the 373 aircraft Ozawa launched in the first strike, only 30 returned to their carriers. The second strike fared no better. The third strike encountered American fighters and was nearly annihilated. By the end of the day, Ozawa had lost 375 aircraft. The Americans lost 30. American pilots would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase that captured the one-sided nature of the slaughter. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. But the disaster wasn't finished. That night, American submarines stalked the retreating Japanese carriers. 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, were torpedoed and sunk. The next day, American aircraft found the remaining Japanese carriers and sank the light carrier Hio. In 2 days, Ozawa had lost 3 carriers and over 400 aircraft. The Mobile Fleet had been gutted. Ozawa's report to naval headquarters in Tokyo was devastatingly honest. The Americans hadn't just won the battle, they had demonstrated a level of material and tactical superiority that made future carrier operations impossible. American radar gave them advance warning of every strike. American fighter direction allowed them to position their defenses perfectly. American aircraft outperformed Japanese aircraft in almost every category, and American numbers were so overwhelming that even if Japanese pilots had been superior, which they no longer were, it wouldn't have mattered. After the Philippine Sea, Japan had no effective carrier force remaining. A few carriers still existed, but without aircraft and trained pilots, a carrier was just a floating platform with no combat value. The war at sea was effectively over. Japan would never again challenge American naval forces in a conventional battle. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyota received Ozawa's report and understood that the carrier war had ended in complete American victory. Japan's carrier force, which had been the finest in the world in December 1941, had been systematically destroyed, not through superior American tactics or better American admirals, but through weight of numbers. The Americans had simply built more carriers, more aircraft, trained more pilots. They could afford losses that would cripple Japan. They could launch strikes that would overwhelm any defense. The intelligence assessment that crossed Toyota's desk in July 1944 provided final confirmation of what everyone already knew. American aircraft production for 1944 would exceed 96,000 aircraft. Japan would produce approximately 16,000, 6-1, and American aircraft were superior in performance. The new Hellcat and Corsair fighters dominated the Zero. American bombers carried heavier loads over longer ranges. American transports moved troops and supplies more efficiently. Japan's aircraft industry was operating at maximum capacity, but maximum capacity meant working with limited aluminum, limited steel, limited everything. Several factories had been damaged in American bombing raids. Production would decline through late 1944 and into 1945 as American B-29s operating from the Marianas intensified their attacks on Japanese industry. Toyota sat alone in his office in the Navy Ministry building, listening to air raid sirens wail across Tokyo. B-29s were coming again, hundreds of them, flying at altitudes Japanese fighters struggled to reach, dropping incendiary bombs that would set fire to entire districts. The bases those B-29s operated from had been captured because Japan couldn't defend them. The Marianas had fallen because American carrier forces had destroyed Japanese air power in the Philippine Sea, and American carrier forces existed because American shipyards could build carriers at rates Japan couldn't match. Everything connected back to the same fundamental reality. American industrial capacity operated on a scale that Japan had never been able to approach. The war had been lost before it started, lost in the factories and shipyards and steel mills that turned American resources into weapons at rates that made numerical superiority absolute. In October 1944, American forces invaded the Philippines, returning to the islands they had lost in 1942. The Japanese High Command decided to commit everything remaining to defend the Philippines. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from its oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. Without oil, the war was over. With oil, at least, the war could continue. Perhaps long enough that the Americans might tire of the casualties and negotiate. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was Japan's last major naval offensive. Admiral Kurita Takeo commanded the center force built around the battleships Yamamoto and Musashi, the two largest battleships ever constructed. Admiral Ozawa commanded the northern force, a decoy fleet built around Japan's 4 remaining carriers, now with almost no aircraft embarked. Admiral Nishimura commanded the southern force, older battleships and cruisers tasked with hitting the American landing beaches. The plan was complex, requiring precise coordination between forces that could not effectively communicate with each other. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all Japan had left. The battle lasted 3 days and ranged over hundreds of miles of ocean. When it ended, the Japanese Navy had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. Musashi was sunk by American carrier aircraft, hit by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. She took hours to sink, her massive hull absorbing punishment that would have destroyed any other ship, but eventually she rolled over and went down. All 4 Japanese carriers in the northern force were sunk. 3 battleships were sunk. 10 cruisers were lost. The Americans lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Japan had committed nearly everything it had left to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The mobile fleet, the combined fleet, all the proud names and traditions, all the years of training and preparation, all of it was gone, sunk in Philippine waters, or scattered and retreating back to Japan with fuel tanks nearly empty and no prospects of replacement or repair. Admiral Ugaki, who had been Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet at the beginning of the war and was now commanding battleship forces, wrote in his diary after Leyte Gulf, "The Combined Fleet has ceased to exist. We have lost everything. The Americans did not defeat us through superior tactics or better seamanship. They defeated us through sheer overwhelming material superiority. For every ship we sank, they had 3 more. For every aircraft we shot down, they had 10 more. We were fighting mathematics, and mathematics cannot be defeated through courage or will." In November 1944, as the reality of total defeat became undeniable, some officers in the high command began proposing desperate measures. Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro proposed using kamikaze attacks, suicide missions, where pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships. It was a brutal calculation. If Japan couldn't match American production, couldn't replace losses, couldn't train enough pilots, then perhaps suicide attacks could multiply the effectiveness of what remained. One plane, one pilot, one ship. The younger officers embraced the idea with enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. They spoke of honor and sacrifice, of dying gloriously for the emperor. The older officers, men like Toyota and Ugaki, who understood that the war was lost, said nothing. What could they say? That these young men were being asked to die in a cause that was already hopeless, that their sacrifices would accomplish nothing except perhaps delaying the inevitable by weeks or months. The kamikaze attacks began in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and continued through the remaining months of the war. Japanese pilots, some of them barely trained, would load their aircraft with bombs and deliberately crash into American ships. The attacks inflicted casualties. Ships were damaged and sunk. American sailors died, but the fundamental mathematics didn't change. For every ship the kamikazes sank, American shipyards launched 5 more. The attacks were tactically effective, but strategically meaningless. By early 1945, American forces were approaching the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima fell in March after a brutal battle that cost thousands of American casualties. Okinawa fell in June after an even bloodier campaign. American B-29s were firebombing Japanese cities, burning entire urban districts in single raids. The Japanese economy was collapsing. Fuel was gone. Food was scarce. Industrial production was declining rapidly as factories were destroyed or lacked raw materials. And still, American production continued. Intelligence reports in March 1945 indicated that American aircraft production for the year would exceed 90,000 aircraft. Even though the war in Europe had ended and production was being scaled back, Japan's production for 1945 would be perhaps 5,000 aircraft, mostly kamikaze planes, cheap aircraft built with minimal materials and designed for one-way missions. 90,000 American aircraft against 5,000 Japanese suicide planes. The disparity had become so vast that comparing the numbers was almost meaningless. It was like comparing an ocean to a puddle, a mountain to a grain of sand. The scale was incomprehensible. Admiral Toyota sat in his office in the Navy Ministry building in April 1945, reviewing the final production reports. He was 60 years old, had spent his entire adult life in the Navy, had risen to command the combined fleet, and now he was presiding over its complete destruction. Not because he had failed as a commander, not because Japanese sailors and pilots had failed in their duty, but because they had fought a war against an industrial system that operated at a scale they had never imagined possible. He thought about all the warnings that had been ignored, Yamamoto's warnings before the war about American industrial capacity, the intelligence reports in 1942 showing American production rates, the evidence from Guadalcanal and the Solomons showing American material superiority. Every warning had been dismissed or minimized or explained away because accepting the truth meant accepting that the war was unwinnable. In May 1945, Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, serving as Navy Minister, met with Emperor Hirohito to discuss the possibility of ending the war. Yonai had opposed war with America in 1941 and had been removed from office for his opposition. Now, brought back into government as the situation became desperate, he had the grim satisfaction of seeing his predictions proven correct. "Your Majesty," Yonai said carefully, "we have lost the war. Not on the battlefield, though we have lost there as well. We lost in the factories. The Americans produced so many ships, so many aircraft, so many weapons that our forces were overwhelmed by sheer quantity. We were outbuilt, outproduced, outmanufactured. Fighting, spirit, and courage cannot overcome such material disparity." The Emperor asked if there was any possibility of improving production, of matching American output. Yonai's answer was blunt. Your Majesty, the Americans are producing more aircraft in a month than we can produce in a year. They have been doing this for 3 years. They will continue doing this for as long as the war continues. We cannot match them. We never could have matched them. Admiral Yamamoto tried to tell us this in 1941. We did not listen. The war would continue for 3 more months after that conversation. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. It had never been in doubt for anyone who understood the production figures. Japan surrendered in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The official reason given was the new and most cruel bomb. But that was face-saving language. Japan surrendered because the war was already lost, had been lost for years. The atomic bombs provided a convenient explanation, a way to surrender without admitting that Japan had been beaten by American factories and shipyards. Better to say they surrendered to a superweapon than to admit they had surrendered to logistics and industrial organization and production capacity. Years after the war, historians would recover Admiral Ugaki's diary. In it, they found entries from throughout the war documenting his growing understanding of Japan's hopeless situation. One entry from December 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, captured the essence of what had happened. I have reviewed the intelligence assessments of American production capacity. If these numbers are accurate, and I have no reason to doubt they are, then we are not fighting a war. We are committing national suicide. The Americans can replace every loss. They can do this indefinitely. We cannot. The mathematics are simple and brutal. We will run out of everything before they run out of anything. He had understood. They had all understood by 1943 at the latest. But understanding didn't change the outcome. The culture demanded fighting to the death. Surrender was unthinkable. Admitting the mistake would destroy the credibility of the entire military leadership, and so the war continued for 2 more years, and hundreds of thousands more people died, Japanese and American and others, in a war whose outcome had been determined before it started. The Japanese officers who had mocked American industry in 1941, who had laughed at American workers, who demanded weekends and 8-hour shifts, who had assumed that fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage, they learned the truth the hard way. They learned it in the skies over Guadalcanal, where American aircraft kept coming, no matter how many were shot down. They learned it in the waters of the Philippine Sea, where American carriers appeared in numbers that seemed impossible. They learned it at Leyte Gulf, where the entire combined fleet was destroyed because the Americans simply had more of everything. They learned that when industrial capacity disparities reach certain levels, tactics and training and courage become irrelevant. They learned that you cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy who can replace losses at 10 times, 20 times, 50 times your rate. They learned that a nation's power in modern industrial warfare is measured not by the size of its military, but by the capacity of its factories. And above all, they learned that Admiral Yamamoto had been right. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had brought its factories to war. 100,000 aircraft in a single year. That number, more than any battle, more than any tactical victory or defeat, defined the Pacific War. It was a number that represented American industrial potential operating at full capacity. It was a number that made Japanese resistance futile. It was a number that Japan could not match, could not approach, could not even comprehend until they saw the results in the skies above their cities and the waters around their islands. The mockery had stopped by 1943. By then, every Japanese officer who understood the production figures knew the truth. They were fighting a war they could not win against an industrial system that operated beyond anything they had imagined possible. The only question was how long the war would continue and how many more people would die before the inevitable surrender. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.